What if a Hollywood movie triggered a real government security overhaul? Not decades later, but within months of its release. WarGames did exactly that. Blending Cold War paranoia with the dawn of the home computer age, it convinced audiences that a curious teenager with a modem could push humanity to the edge of nuclear war. But getting there was far from simple. The production was plagued by last-minute rewrites, a director replaced mid-shoot, and technology that was equal parts real and brilliantly faked. What's even more surprising is where this story actually began, and it had nothing to do with computers at all. Number 1. The movie wasn't about hackers. Before computers ever entered the picture, the script that would eventually become WarGames was telling a completely different story. Originally titled The Genius, it centered on a brilliant teenager forming an unlikely friendship with a dying scientist. A quiet, character-driven drama with no modems, no military systems, and absolutely no threat of nuclear war. It was intimate, human, and a world away from the Cold War thriller it would ultimately become. As the writers developed the story further, they began weaving in the rapidly emerging world of computer culture and military simulations. What started as a personal drama slowly transformed into something far more ambitious. The technology wasn't the starting point, it grew organically out of the characters themselves, layered in gradually, as the writers realized how much dramatic potential the digital world actually held. That unusual origin is a big part of what makes the finished film work so well. Because the story was built on human connection first, the high-stakes computer thriller wrapped around it feels grounded rather than cold or mechanical. Other tech films of the era leaned hard into gadgetry and spectacle. This one had a beating heart underneath all the hardware. The machines arrived late to the story, but the emotion was there from the very beginning. Number 2. A futurist changed the entire plot. Sometimes the most important person on a production never appears anywhere in the credits. While developing the project, the writers sought out futurist Peter Schwartz at the Stanford Research Institute, hoping to ground their evolving story in something scientifically credible. What they discovered during those sessions turned out to reshape the entire direction of the film. During their research visits, they were introduced to early computer networking and military simulation systems, technologies that most civilians had never encountered and barely knew existed. The conversations opened up a striking and deeply unsettling question. What if a military computer simulation became so sophisticated that it could no longer distinguish between a training exercise and an actual attack? That single idea cracked the story wide open and gave the writers the thriller they had been searching for. The finished film owes its most chilling and enduring premise directly to that consultation. Schwartz's insights didn't just add technical flavor, they completely redirected what the movie was about. Without that visit to Stanford, WarGames might have remained a modest coming-of-age drama about a gifted kid and a dying mentor. Instead, it became a techno-thriller that felt genuinely plausible to audiences, because in many important ways it truly was. Number 3. A real hacker inspired David. Long before Hollywood had any clear picture of what a real hacker actually looked like, the writers went searching for one. They connected with David Scott Lewis, a young computer enthusiast who was already navigating networks and phone systems in ways most people couldn't begin to imagine. His world, equal parts technical brilliance and adolescent curiosity, became the direct blueprint for the film's central character. Lewis demonstrated firsthand how teenagers were quietly exploring early computer systems during the late 1970s, not for financial gain or deliberate destruction, but simply because the access was there and the challenge was irresistible. That spirit of fearless, almost innocent experimentation was exactly the tone the writers needed. His real experiences shaped everything from David Lightman's cluttered bedroom setup to his instinctive talent for finding digital backdoors that nobody had thought to close. Hollywood inevitably smoothed the rougher edges, making the character warmer, more sympathetic, and considerably less legally complicated than the real subculture it was drawing from. But the restless curiosity driving David Lightman across the screen was entirely authentic, borrowed straight from the community Lewis represented. The fictional hacker had a very real and lived-in soul powering him from behind the scenes. Number 4. Sneaking into NORAD for research. Getting inside one of the most heavily fortified military installations in the world is not typically part of a screenwriter's research process. But the writers behind the film pushed hard for access to the real NORAD command center buried deep inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. And after a sustained campaign of persistent requests, they were remarkably granted entry to the facility. The visit proved considerably more eventful than a standard research trip. NORAD Commander General James Hardinger reportedly confronted the writers directly during the tour, engaging them in a candid and surprisingly detailed discussion about how the real command systems actually functioned. Rather than shutting their research down or limiting what they could see, the encounter handed them an authentic insider perspective that no declassified document or public briefing could have replicated. That extraordinary access is visible throughout the finished film. The military sequences carry a weight and institutional credibility that feels genuinely earned, because in a very real sense, it was. The production team hadn't simply imagined what those underground command centers looked like or how the people inside them behaved under pressure. They had stood on that floor, looked at those screens, and spoken to the people in charge. It shows in every frame set inside that mountain. Number 5. The movie almost had space lasers. Not every idea that survives into an early draft deserves to make it any further. Among the more striking concepts explored during the script's development was a fictional defense system called OLI, short for Omnipresent Laser Interceptor, an ambitious network of space-based laser weapons designed to intercept and destroy incoming enemy missiles high above the Earth's surface before they could ever reach their targets. It wasn't a completely outlandish concept for its era. The early 1980s were saturated with bold and sometimes wildly optimistic visions of futuristic military hardware, and space-based defense systems were actively being discussed at the highest levels of government. But as the writers pushed deeper into the script, the laser platform concept began pulling the story in the wrong direction, away from the grounded, credible thriller they were carefully building and towards something that felt more like pure science fiction. Replacing OLI with the automated WOPR supercomputer proved to be exactly the right creative decision. A machine that could reason, simulate, and potentially initiate a war entirely on its own terms was a far more disturbing and resonant threat than any weapon orbiting in space. The danger became abstract, invisible, and coldly logical, something no missile defense system could neutralize. It was the kind of enemy that couldn't be shot down, only reasoned with. And as the film's finale makes devastatingly clear, even that was barely enough. Number 6. John Lennon nearly played Falcon. Among the most remarkable casting stories in Hollywood history, few are as striking as this one. During the early development of the film, the producers floated the idea of approaching John Lennon for the role of Professor Stephen Falcon, the brilliant, reclusive scientist at the heart of the story. The character was conceived as a visionary genius who had retreated entirely from the world, a man of towering intellect worn down by disillusionment. It was in many ways a role that seemed to fit Lennon's public persona with an almost eerie precision. Lennon reportedly expressed genuine interest in the project before his tragic death in December 1980 brought the possibility to a permanent close. The loss reshaped the casting entirely, and the production eventually moved on. The role ultimately went to British stage actor John Wood, who brought his own quiet intensity and philosophical melancholy to the character, creating a Falcon that felt weathered, wise, and genuinely haunted by what his own genius had helped build. It's impossible to know what Lennon's version of Falcon would have looked like, but the thought experiment is a fascinating one. His presence would have added an entirely different cultural dimension to the film, a real-world icon of peace, playing a man who had helped design the machinery of global destruction. Wood's performance is excellent on its own terms, but the road not taken here is one of cinema's more intriguing what-ifs. Number 7. The director was fired mid-production. Few events can destabilize a film production quite as severely as replacing the director after shooting has already begun. Yet that is precisely what happened here. WarGames began production under director Martin Brest, who would later go on to make Beverly Hills Cop and Midnight Run. Within just a few weeks of filming, however, MGM concluded that the footage wasn't working and made the difficult decision to let him go. The studio brought in John Badham as a replacement, handing him a production already in motion, a cast already established, and footage already shot that he had no part in creating. It was an unenviable position by any measure. Mid-production director changes of this kind are rare, precisely because they carry such enormous risk. The creative disruption alone can unravel a film that might otherwise have come together naturally. That WarGames not only survived the transition but ultimately thrived is a testament to how decisively and confidently Badham took control of the material. He reviewed what existed, identified the problems clearly, and steered the production in a new direction with enough authority that the seams are essentially invisible in the finished cut. What could have become a cautionary tale about studio interference turned into one of the decade's most accomplished mainstream thrillers. Number 8. The fix that saved the film. When John Badham sat down to review the footage his predecessor had shot, his diagnosis of the problem was immediate and unambiguous. The young cast was playing the material too straight, treating the hacking sequences and computer experiments with a heavy seriousness that drained the energy from every scene. The film felt airless and grim when it needed to feel alive. The performances weren't bad, but the tone was fundamentally wrong for the story being told. Badham's solution was elegantly simple. He encouraged the actors, Matthew Broderick in particular, to approach the hacking scenes not as high-stakes dramatic moments, but as genuine fun. These were teenagers playing with technology they found thrilling, pushing boundaries because it was exciting, not because they fully understood the consequences. That shift in framing changed everything about how the scenes read on camera. The results are visible throughout the finished film. There's a lightness and spontaneity to Broderick's performance that makes David Lightman genuinely likable rather than merely clever. The humor feels natural rather than inserted. And crucially, when the stakes do become serious and the danger becomes real, the contrast lands with far greater force because the audience has spent time enjoying the ride alongside him. That tonal recalibration made early and decisively is arguably what the film's success rests on. Number 9. Hollywood faked the hacking. The computer sequences in the film look impressively fluid and immediate. Fingers flying across keyboards, systems responding in real time, information appearing on screen exactly when the story needs it to. What audiences were actually watching, however, was a carefully constructed illusion built around a fundamental practical problem that the production had to solve early on. Real computer interactions from the early 1980s were slow, uneven, and deeply uncinematic. Logging into a system, waiting for a response, watching text crawl across a screen at the pace actual hardware allowed. None of it was remotely usable as filmed entertainment. To get around this, the production's technical team prepared the desired outputs in advance, feeding the correct text to the screens at controlled speeds and timings that served the scene rather than reflecting technical reality. The actors were essentially performing alongside a precisely choreographed display. The result was a version of computer use that felt believable to audiences while compressing hours of actual process into seconds of screen time. Ironically, those stage sequences became so influential that they effectively defined what cinematic hacking looks like, not just for the 1980s, but for decades of films and television that followed. The illusion was so convincing that it became the standard. Real hacking may look nothing like this, but on screen, it has looked like this ever since. Number 10. The film hid a real Cold War computer. Hidden within the film's visual fabric is a detail that most audiences watched without recognizing for what it actually was. A brief sequence in the movie incorporates real footage of a genuine Cold War-era computer system. Not a prop, not a reconstruction, but actual hardware from one of the most significant defense computing projects in American history. The machine belonged to the SAGE Air Defense Network, the semi-automatic ground environment, one of the largest and most complex computer systems ever constructed. Built during the 1950s and operational through much of the Cold War, SAGE was designed to process radar data from across the continent and coordinate a national air defense response in real time. Each SAGE installation filled an entire building and consumed power on a scale that seems almost incomprehensible today. The system represented the cutting edge of what computing could do at the height of superpower tension. Incorporating that real footage was a quiet but effective creative choice. It grounded the fictional world of the film in something documented and tangible, drawing a direct visual line between the military computing of the recent past and the near-future scenario the story was exploring. For most viewers, it registered simply as convincing production design. But for those who recognized it, it added an extra layer of unease, a reminder that the film's central anxieties weren't purely invented. The infrastructure of automated defense already existed. The movie was just asking what happened next. Number 11. War dialing became a real term. There's a particular kind of cultural power that belongs to films capable of naming something the world didn't previously have a word for. The sequence in which David Lightman programs his computer to automatically dial thousands of phone numbers in search of other connected systems struck audiences as both thrilling and revelatory, a window into a practice that was already happening in real tech circles but had never been given a public identity. That identity arrived with the film. The technique soon became universally known as war dialing, a term coined in direct reference to the movie and rapidly adopted by the emerging cybersecurity community. The practice itself predated the film. Curious hobbyists and early network explorers had been doing versions of it for years, but it existed without a name. Tucked away in the corners of a subculture most people had no access to. The movie pulled it into the open and handed it a label that stuck permanently. The fact that a Hollywood production coined terminology now used in professional cybersecurity is a genuinely unusual distinction. Technical fields typically develop their own vocabulary internally, resistant to outside influence. That a mainstream thriller managed to contribute lasting language to a real discipline speaks to how precisely and authentically the film captured something that was actually happening. Decades later, war dialing remains a documented concept in network security literature, and it owes its name entirely to a fictional teenager's bedroom computer. Number 12. The famous WOPR was destroyed. Few props in 1980s cinema are as immediately recognizable as the WOPR, the towering, blinking supercomputer at the center of the film's most dramatic sequences. The production built it as a massive physical installation, an imposing wall of lights and panels designed to fill the screen and communicate raw computational power in purely visual terms. It was exactly the kind of tangible, large-scale filmmaking artifact that modern productions increasingly replace with digital alternatives. What happened to it after filming ended is a story that still frustrates film preservation enthusiasts. Rather than being stored, donated, or retained for promotional use, the prop was simply dismantled and discarded once production wrapped. There was no archive, no museum arrangement, no recognition that the object might carry lasting cultural value. It was treated as a practical construction that had served its purpose and was no longer needed, a decision that looks considerably less reasonable with the benefit of hindsight. Today, the original WOPR exists only in the footage it was built to appear in. The physical object is gone entirely, leaving behind only photographs, film frames, and the painstaking replica builds undertaken by dedicated fans and collectors over the years since. Those fan reconstructions are now the closest thing to the real prop that anyone can actually see in person. It's a surprisingly common fate for iconic film artifacts from that era, and a reminder of how little the industry once valued its own physical history. Number 13. The IMSI modem was a lie. One of the most recognizable pieces of technology in the entire film is the modem sitting on David Lightman's desk, the device through which a teenager apparently gains access to military systems and nearly triggers a global catastrophe. To audiences at the time and to tech-minded viewers ever since, it appears to be an IMSI 212A modem, a real piece of hardware that carried genuine credibility with the home computer community of the early 1980s. The reality was considerably more theatrical. The device on screen was actually a different modem entirely, dressed up with a fake IMSI label applied specifically for filming. The production team wanted equipment that looked visually compelling on camera. The right size, the right aesthetic, the right combination of lights and physical presence to read well on screen. Whether it was actually what it appeared to be was a secondary concern at best. The label was chosen for its appearance, not its accuracy. The irony runs deep. A prop built around a false identity helped define the visual language of cinematic hacking so completely that it influenced countless productions that followed. That specific look, the boxy hardware, the blinking indicator lights, the sense of a machine doing something secretive and consequential became the default shorthand for hacking on screen for years. The fake label fooled audiences, shaped a genre aesthetic, and became more culturally significant than the real hardware it was impersonating. In Hollywood terms, that's a remarkably successful deception. Number 14. A real NORAD scare inspired it. The scenario at the heart of the film, a computer system misreading information and pushing the world toward nuclear catastrophe, struck many viewers as a brilliantly paranoid piece of fiction. It was not entirely fiction. Several years before the script was written, a real incident had already demonstrated exactly how fragile the boundary between simulation and reality could become inside automated defense systems. In 1979, a training tape containing a simulated nuclear attack scenario was accidentally fed into live US defense computers, triggering genuine alarm within the system. For a brief and deeply alarming period, military personnel worked urgently to determine whether the warning was real before the error was identified and the alert stood down. The incident exposed a critical vulnerability, not in the hardware itself, but in the assumption that human oversight would always be sufficient to catch a catastrophic mistake before it escalated. That event never became widely known to the public, but it reached the writers at exactly the right moment in their research. The film exaggerated the scenario considerably for dramatic effect, pushing the premise to its most extreme logical conclusion. But the core anxiety it was dramatizing had already happened in a real operations center, with real personnel making real decisions under genuine pressure. The thriller was built on a foundation that was far more factual than most audiences ever realized, and that underlying truth is part of what gives the film its lasting unease. Number 15. Apple II powered the WOPR countdown. The WOPR, as seen on screen, projects an image of overwhelming computational power, a machine of almost incomprehensible sophistication capable of running thousands of nuclear war simulations simultaneously while counting down toward a real-world launch. The visual language of the prop communicates scale, complexity, and danger with considerable effectiveness. What was actually generating those dramatic countdown displays tells a very different story. Hidden inside the enormous physical structure of the WOPR prop was a single Apple II personal computer, operated by a technician who sat concealed within the set during filming. The Apple II was one of the most popular home computers of its era, the kind of machine that sat on kitchen tables and in school classrooms across America. It was about as far from a military supercomputer as it was possible to get while still being a functioning piece of technology. Yet it was entirely responsible for the visual output that gave the WOPR its on-screen menace. The technical team built custom software to generate the countdown sequences and display graphics that the scenes required, running it all through that single modest machine with a human operator triggering the outputs on cue. It worked because the filmmakers understood something important. Audiences respond to what they see, not to what's producing it. The Apple II never appears on screen. The WOPR does, massive, blinking, and apparently capable of ending the world. That gap between visible fiction and hidden reality is one of the more quietly amusing secrets in the film's production history. Number 16. The movie sparked Modem mania. The cultural ripple effects of a genuinely well-timed film can be difficult to measure precisely, but in this case, the evidence was unusually concrete. In the months following the film's release, technology publications began reporting a striking and largely unexpected surge in consumer interest in computer modems, the devices that allowed home computers to communicate over standard telephone lines. The timing left little room for doubt about what had caused it. For most home computer owners in 1983, a modem was a peripheral they had heard of but never felt a compelling reason to acquire. The film changed that calculation almost overnight. Audiences watched a teenager use one to reach across phone lines into systems around the country, and suddenly, the technology felt not just accessible, but genuinely exciting. It reframed the modem from a niche piece of hardware into a portal, a device that connected an isolated machine to an entire invisible world of other computers waiting to be found. One prominent technology magazine went as far as crediting the film directly with introducing the concept of phone line networking to thousands of ordinary consumers who had never previously considered it. That shift in perception had real consequences for the industry. Modem sales climbed, online communities began to grow, and the idea of a networked personal computer started its long journey from specialist enthusiasm to everyday expectation. The film didn't invent any of this, but it accelerated it in ways the industry itself hadn't anticipated, simply by making the possibility look thrilling on a cinema screen. Number 17. Ali Sheedy was truly confused. Behind some of the most effective performances in technical films lies a paradox that directors rarely advertise. Genuine confusion can be more convincing on screen than carefully researched understanding. When Ali Sheedy later discussed her experience making the film, she was candid about the fact that much of the technical dialogue in the script was genuinely difficult for her to follow. The specifics of what the computers were doing, what the systems meant, and what the stakes actually were on a technical level frequently escaped her during production. What could have been a liability became one of the film's quiet strengths. Her character Jennifer functions throughout the story as the audience's most natural point of identification. Someone smart and engaged but not technically fluent, asking the questions that viewers at home were almost certainly asking themselves. 'Cause Sheedy wasn't performing confusion but in many moments actually experiencing something close to it, those reactions carry an authenticity that more technically prepared acting might have smoothed away entirely. It's a dynamic that director John Badham apparently recognized and chose to work with rather than correct. Sheedy's performance grounds the film's more technical sequences in human terms, preventing them from becoming incomprehensible to anyone outside the computer hobbyist community. Her presence alongside Matthew Broderick creates a balance that serves the story well. One character who understands the machines and one who understands the stakes. Together, they give the audience both the information and the emotion the film needs to function. Number 18. The NORAD screens were real effects. Modern film productions routinely shoot their actors against empty green screens, adding the surrounding visuals in post-production long after the cameras have stopped rolling. It's efficient, flexible, and increasingly indistinguishable from physical reality when done well. The production team behind this film took a fundamentally different approach, one that placed considerably more demand on the pre-production process, but delivered something that digital compositing still struggles to fully replicate. Rather than planning to add the command center's displays after the fact, the filmmakers built fully functional screen systems directly into the set. All of the maps, threat displays, tracking graphics, and data visualizations were prepared in advance and played back live on the actual screens during filming. The actors weren't reacting to blank walls or colored markers. They were responding to real moving images filling the space around them, exactly as those images would appear in the finished film. The practical consequences of that decision are visible in every scene set inside the NORAD command center. The light from the screens falls naturally on the actors' faces. Their eye lines are accurate. Their reactions have the specific quality that comes from responding to something genuinely present in the room. These are details that audiences rarely consciously identify but absolutely register. The difference between a performance that feels inhabited and one that feels assembled. The choice to do it practically under considerably greater logistical pressure paid dividends that are still visible on screen more than 4 decades later. Number 19. 500,000 frames of graphics. The command center sequences in the film are visually dense in a way that rewards attention. Displays filled with tracking data, maps updating in real time, threat indicators shifting as the scenario escalates. Creating that visual environment required a production effort that was extraordinary by any standard, but was particularly remarkable given the tools available at the time and the complete absence of the digital shortcuts that modern productions take entirely for granted. The work fell primarily to computer graphics specialist Colin Cantwell, who had previously contributed visual effects work to some of the most ambitious science fiction productions of the era. Working with a bank of HP computers and custom software, Cantwell and his team generated the imagery that would fill the command center screens throughout the film. The process was painstaking, sequential, and time-consuming in ways that are almost difficult to conceive of from a contemporary perspective. The final output reportedly amounted to approximately 500,000 individual frames of computer-generated imagery, a figure that communicates both the scope of the undertaking and the methodical precision required to complete it. Each sequence had to be planned, generated, reviewed, and integrated into the practical screen systems that would play it back on set. For 1983, this represented a frontier-level technical achievement, accomplished without the rendering farms, real-time preview tools, or iterative workflows that modern effects artists rely on as standard. The results filled the screen with a visual complexity that made the command center feel genuinely alive. Number 20. Hackers feared WarGames panic. Not every member of the tech community greeted the film's cultural impact with enthusiasm. For those already living inside hacker and computer hobbyist circles, the movie's enormous mainstream success carried a shadow, a growing public fear of exactly the kind of curious, exploratory behavior that defined their world. The gap between what the film depicted and what most hobbyists actually did with their computers was vast, but that distinction proved very difficult to communicate once the panic took hold. Few people experienced this more directly than Kevin Mitnick, who would go on to become one of the most publicly scrutinized figures in early hacker history. Mitnick later recounted how prosecutors and law enforcement officials consistently invoked the film when describing his alleged capabilities, suggesting that he possessed the ability to access military systems and cause catastrophic damage simply by picking up a telephone. The accusations bore little relationship to reality, but they landed effectively in front of juries and in newspaper headlines primed by the film's scenario. The movie had handed authorities a cultural reference point that made extreme claims about hackers feel self-evidently plausible to anyone who had seen it. That framing shaped public perception of computer intrusion for years, transforming what was often driven by curiosity and technical enthusiasm into something that looked, through the film's lens, like deliberate and potentially apocalyptic sabotage. The real hacker community paid a long and complicated price for the thriller that had inadvertently made their hobby look like a national security threat. Number 21. The film premiered at Cannes. Getting taken seriously as a work of cinema is rarely guaranteed for a Hollywood thriller built around a teenage protagonist and home computer equipment. The critical landscape of the early 1980s was not always generous to mainstream genre films, and there was every reason to expect that a story about a boy hacking military systems might be received as lightweight summer entertainment and nothing more. What actually happened was considerably more surprising. WarGames was selected to screen at the Cannes Film Festival shortly before its wide theatrical release, an acknowledgement from one of the world's most prestigious film events that the movie deserved to be seen in serious company. Critics responded with genuine appreciation, praising the film's originality, the intelligence of its premise, and the skill with which it balanced suspense and character. The Cannes screening gave the film a cultural credibility that preceded its commercial release and shaped how it was received by reviewers worldwide. The Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences followed with nominations in 3 technical categories: cinematography, sound, and film editing, a recognition of the craft behind a production that had navigated considerable behind-the-scenes turbulence to reach the screen in polished form. For a film that had survived a director replacement and fundamental creative restructuring mid-shoot, arriving at Cannes and earning Oscar nominations represented a remarkable journey. It confirmed that what audiences were watching was not merely a crowd-pleasing thriller, but a genuinely accomplished piece of filmmaking. Number 22. Hollywood-inspired military tech dreams. There is a particular irony in the idea of real military professionals watching a fictional depiction of their own world and finding it more impressive than the real thing. Yet, that appears to be precisely what happened in certain corners of the defense establishment following the film's release. The command center depicted on screen, filled with large format displays, dynamic maps, and real-time threat tracking, represented a vision of military technology that struck some serving officers as more advanced than the actual systems they worked with every day. Reports emerged suggesting that personnel who had seen the film began asking uncomfortable questions about why their operational environments didn't reflect the same visual sophistication. The fictional NORAD of the movie had set an expectation, an image of what a modern military command center should look like, that the real infrastructure of the time didn't always meet. Fiction had outpaced reality in the minds of at least some of the people responsible for operating that reality, and the gap was apparently noticeable enough to generate conversation. The longer-term consequence of that dynamic is difficult to trace with precision, but the basic phenomenon it illustrates is genuinely fascinating. A production design team working in Hollywood, building sets intended to look plausible to civilian audiences, had inadvertently created a benchmark that influenced how real professionals thought about their own technology. The film didn't just reflect public imagination about military systems. It actively shaped the aspirations of people working inside them. Sometimes the gap between what exists and what people believe should exist is enough to move things forward. Number 23. Hackers treated it like scripture. Across the decades since its release, the film accumulated a cultural status within technology communities that goes well beyond ordinary appreciation for a well-made thriller. For successive generations of programmers, security researchers, and digital explorers, it occupied a specific and unusually significant position. Not just a film they admired, but one that had genuinely shaped how they thought about computers, networks, and the relationship between human curiosity and institutional power. The influence reached people who became significant figures in the technology world. Sergey Brin, who would later co-found Google, has cited the film among those that made a lasting impression during his formative years. The connection runs even deeper in the security community. DEF CON, the world's largest and most prominent hacker conference, takes its name directly from the defense readiness alert levels that drive the film's climax. The conference has been running since 1993, and the reference has never been retired, which says something about how foundational the film remains to the culture that gathering represents. What the film gave that community was something more valuable than technical instruction. It offered a narrative framework, a story in which curiosity was heroic, institutions were fallible, and a single determined individual with genuine understanding of a system could matter more than all the official machinery surrounding it. That framework resonated because it reflected something real about how technology actually works and who actually understands it. The film told a particular kind of person that their instincts were worth following, and that audience never forgot it. Number 24. Reagan watched it at Camp David. The journey from Hollywood production to genuine policy influence is one that most films never complete, regardless of how politically charged their subject matter might be. The chain of events that began when a particular copy of this film was screened at Camp David in the summer of 1983 is one of the more extraordinary examples of that journey actually happening, and happening with unusual speed and directness. President Ronald Reagan watched the film at the presidential retreat and was sufficiently struck by its central scenario to raise it at a subsequent meeting with his Joint Chiefs of Staff. According to accounts of that meeting, Reagan asked his senior military advisors directly whether the situation depicted in the film, a young civilian gaining unauthorized access to military computer systems and nearly triggering a nuclear exchange, was actually possible. The question, coming from the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces, was not one that could be deflected or dismissed with reassurances about fictional premises. The answer Reagan reportedly received was more alarming than comfortable. Rather than being told that the film's scenario was purely imaginary, he was informed that the vulnerability it depicted was real, and that the nation's computer networks were considerably less secure than the public, or apparently the president himself had previously understood. A Hollywood thriller had walked into the Situation Room and asked a question that the most powerful military establishment in the world had to answer honestly. The consequences of that answer would extend well beyond the screening room at Camp David. Number 25. A movie triggered real cyber policy. The conversation that began with a presidential screening did not stay confined to informal discussion for long. Following Reagan's inquiries and the responses he received from military and intelligence officials, a formal process was initiated to assess the actual state of security across government computer networks. What that assessment found was serious enough to generate action at the highest levels of the administration, action that would eventually take the form of binding national policy. The findings contributed directly to the drafting of National Security Decision Directive 145, known as NSDD 145, signed in 1984. The directive addressed the security of telecommunications systems and computer networks across the federal government, establishing guidelines for protecting sensitive information from unauthorized access. It was one of the earliest formal policy frameworks in American history to grapple with what would eventually become known as cybersecurity, a field that barely had a name at the time the directive was written. The lineage running from a fictional teenager's bedroom computer to a signed presidential directive is one that historians of technology policy have documented carefully, and it remains genuinely remarkable. Films shape culture, shift public perception, and occasionally influence the people who consume them toward different ways of thinking. Very rarely do they generate binding government policy within a year of release. WarGames did exactly that, not by presenting solutions, but by asking a question loudly enough that the people responsible for the answers could no longer avoid confronting them. That may be the most enduring and least expected legacy of a film that set out simply to tell a good story about a boy, a computer, and a game that got dangerously out of hand. More than 4 decades after its release, WarGames stands as one of the most quietly prophetic films ever to come out of Hollywood. What began as a character drama about friendship was reshaped by real hackers, real military facilities, and real Cold War anxieties into something that felt genuinely urgent, and turned out to be more accurate about the future than almost anyone involved could have predicted. Behind the polished thriller on screen was a production held together by a director change, creative improvisation, and technical ingenuity that the audience was never supposed to notice. If this breakdown of the secrets behind WarGames kept you watching, hit like and subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into the films that shaped our world. And drop a comment below. Which of these secrets genuinely caught you off guard?